Have you ever heard about the mystery of the third day after death? In different parts of the world, there are reports, traditions, and beliefs that surround this period as if it were a window between the living and the dead. But what really happens at that moment? Why do so many cultures attribute a special meaning to this time frame? Coincidence, myth, or is there something deeper behind this idea? Imagine absolute silence after a storm. The world seems to have stopped, trying to understand how to move on. It is precisely in these moments, when the pain of loss is most intense, that questions arise. Where do those we love go? Can they hear us? And why does the third day always seem shrouded in mystery? Whether in stories told by grandparents, ancient legends, sacred books, or even in films, the belief in the third day after death is something that spans civilizations and eras. For some, it is when the soul bids farewell to the physical world. For others, it is the beginning of its eternal journey. But is there a deeper explanation? Is it just a superstition, or is there something that even science is beginning to understand? Let's forget for a moment the disputes between faith and reason. Imagine a soul, light as a ray of sunset. 3 days, 72 hours, an insignificant time for the universe, but eternal for those in mourning. Perhaps it is during this period that something extraordinary happens, something that connects ancient Buddhist practices, orthodox rituals, and traditions of isolated villages where tables are set with food for the dead. But why exactly 3 days? Why not 2, 5, or 7? Think of fairy tales and mythologies that always mention the third day as a moment of revelation. It is on the third day that magical doors open, that heroes are reborn, that something important manifests. Even nature itself seems to follow this logic. Seeds begin to sprout 3 days after the rain. Butterflies emerge from the cocoon on the third dawn. Could this be just a coincidence? The third day is not only a religious concept, it appears in ancient records and in the beliefs of millennial civilizations. In ancient Egypt, it was believed that the soul, Ba, wandered between worlds for 3 days before facing Osiris's judgment. In Greek myths, heroes who descended into the underworld took 3 days to return to the surface. In shamanic tribes of Siberia, it is precisely on the third day that farewell rituals are performed so that the soul does not remain trapped in limbo. Could this be just a cultural pattern, or is there a psychological explanation for it? Modern research indicates that in the first 3 days after a loss, the human mind remains in a state of shock, unable to fully accept the reality. On the third day, however, there is a moment of understanding. The person truly realizes that the loved one is gone. The rituals marking this period may not have been made for the dead, but rather for the living, helping to deal with the pain and the transition from denial to acceptance. But there is something even more intriguing. In 2021, neuroscientists in California made a surprising discovery. They noticed that up to 72 hours after death, some cells in the body still exhibit electrical activity. Although this does not mean life, it is also not a total and instantaneous death. In ancient traditions, it is said that for 3 days, the soul still maintains a bond with the body, like an invisible thread on the verge of breaking. This aligns with what the Tibetan Book of the Dead describes: a transitional phase in which the soul can still perceive the physical world. What does this mean? For some, it may be an indication that consciousness does not extinguish immediately, but dissipates gradually. For others, it might be just a biological reflection of the end of the life cycle. Either way, the fact is that, in all parts of the world, people feel that something happens during this period. Regardless of religion or belief, the third day after death is a moment filled with symbolism. For Christians, it was on the third day that Christ rose, bringing hope to the faithful. Therefore, it is believed that the souls of the deceased undergo a transition during this period, concluding their time on earth and presenting themselves before God. In Orthodox Christianity, the third day is marked by a farewell ritual in which family members pay a final tribute before allowing the soul to follow its path. In Catholic traditions, 3 candles are lit, representing the body, the soul, and eternal memory. In Buddhism and Hinduism, the third day also holds special meaning. According to these traditions, the soul enters the bardo, an intermediate state between life and death, where it must choose its path for the next existence. During these 3 days, family members recite prayers to help it break free from earthly attachments. In India, the third day is marked by the Shraddha, a ritual where loved ones prepare a symbolic banquet, believing that the soul feeds on the aromas of the food before departing for good. In Islam, the third day is also an important moment. During this period, family members gather to pray and ask God for mercy on the soul of the deceased. It's believed that during these hours, the soul can still see the consequences of its earthly actions, but has not yet completely detached from the physical world. In African tribes where Christianity has merged with animist beliefs, the third day is celebrated differently. In some cultures, dances and songs are performed not as a party, but as a way to help the soul fly and find its way. According to a Yoruba proverb, weeping keeps them here, dancing takes them beyond, and doju. But what if all these beliefs have a common root? And what if, instead of seeing death as an absolute end, it is merely a passage? The third day might not be just a random number, but a symbolic bridge between 2 worlds, that of the living and that of the dead. Science is still seeking answers. Researchers analyze accounts of near-death experiences, where people describe visions, encounters with loved ones, and a tunnel of light. Some scientists suggest that these phenomena may be explained by the release of dimethyltryptamine, DMT, in the brain, a natural compound that can induce altered states of consciousness. But is that enough to explain the similarities among so many cultures? Another study conducted by neuroscientists in Sweden discovered something intriguing. Some cells in the body activate specific genes 72 hours after death, similar to those activated at the beginning of life when an embryo starts to form. This raises even more questions. Is there a biological window in death just as there is in birth? Could that be why many traditions speak of 3 days as a period of transition? What we know is that, regardless of faith or science, millions of people around the world feel that there is something special about these 3 days. Whether it is in the candle lit by a grandmother in Georgia, the lanterns released into the sky in China, or the incense smoke in Japan, what unites all these practices is the hope that the bond between the living and the dead has not been completely broken. While some people search for answers in sacred scriptures, others try to find meaning in the world of science. The third day after death can be seen as a period of transformation, whether spiritual or biological. This leads us to question, how far does the influence of the mind extend in grief and in the perception of this phenomenon? In different parts of the world, there are reports of striking experiences on the third day after the loss of a loved one. People say they feel presences, hear familiar voices, or even notice signs in personal objects. Some call it a coincidence. Others believe that the soul really manifests itself in some way before moving on. An intriguing example comes from Mexico, where the Dia de los Muertos is one of the most important traditions of the local culture. During this period, it is believed that souls return to visit the living and say farewell. On the third day of the celebration, some say that the deceased finally leave the earth, moving on to their final destination. To symbolize this passage, altars are adorned with vibrant flowers, candles, and food offerings, creating a connection between the living and the dead. In indigenous tribes of the Amazon, a similar ritual takes place. On the third day after the death of a tribe member, shamans perform ceremonies in which they chant and draw sacred symbols on the faces of the family members. They believe that at that moment the soul crosses invisible rivers to meet its ancestors, and it is necessary to guide it so that it does not get lost. In Japan, an ancient tradition states that on the third day, the soul still watches the living. Therefore, families usually burn incense and offer small plates of rice, believing that the smoke will serve as a bridge to the other side. A Buddhist monk once explained, 3 days is the time it takes for the soul to understand that it no longer belongs to this world. Our role is to help it cross over. But are these rituals just cultural expressions, or is there something that connects them on a deeper level? When we analyze these traditions across different continents, we notice a pattern. The idea that in the first 3 days after death, something important happens. The soul, the consciousness, or the very energy of the person would be in a state of transition. Modern neuroscience is beginning to study the impact of grief in the first 3 days after a loss. A study from the University of Chicago showed that during this period, the brain of the bereaved still acts as if the loved one were present. It is as if the mind has difficulty accepting the definitive absence, creating sensory illusions to fill the void. This may explain why so many people report hearing voices, smelling specific scents, or even noticing shadows at the corner of their eyes. At the same time, there are scientific records of residual brain activity up to 72 hours after death. Although this does not mean that consciousness remains active, some cells in the body still emit electrical signals as if fighting against the definitive end. This mysterious phenomenon raises questions about what really happens during that interval. Could it be a natural process that inspires so many ancient beliefs, or is there something more that we still do not understand? Many scientists avoid definitive conclusions, but even the most skeptical acknowledge that the third day carries a powerful psychological impact. This is the moment when denial begins to give way to acceptance. The rituals that have emerged throughout history may not have been made for the dead, but for the living, helping to transform pain into a process of farewell. Even so, there are stories that defy any rational explanation. Accounts of people who dream of their loved ones on the very third night after death. Objects that move inexplicably. Electronic devices that turn on by themselves during this period. Even reports of animals exhibiting unusual behaviors, like dogs howling into nothingness, or birds landing exactly in the spot where a deceased person used to be. Whether it is a belief, a reflection of grief, or something that science still cannot explain, the fact is that the third day remains a mystery that spans generations. The idea that there is a transition during this period not only comforts hearts, but also reinforces the notion that perhaps death is not an absolute end. In the end, each culture has found its own way of dealing with this issue. Some people light candles, others dance. Some offer silent prayers, while others transform grief into celebration. But they all share the same desire, to believe that farewell is not the end, but a new beginning. Whatever your belief, the third day after death continues to be a mystery that unites cultures and traditions around the world. Perhaps we do not have definitive answers, but there is something that everyone agrees on. Love does not die. It remains in memories, in gestures, and in the small signs of everyday life. If this theme has touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more content about the mysteries of life and death. Share your stories in the comments and help build this space for reflection. After all, even in farewell, the connection between us and those who have left never disappears.